Good afternoon and Happy New Year. Welcome to our members, to today's presenters, and to all those viewing via the media portal. I will now call this regular meeting of the Kentucky Board of Education to order. Today's meeting is being conducted by video teleconference. And I have just a few notes to share about conducting how we conduct the virtual meetings. The meeting must comply with the requirements of the Open Meetings Act. Accordingly, the public may view the meeting via a link provided in the publicized agenda. To board members, please ensure your camera is on, your microphone is working, and that you can be seen throughout the duration of the meeting. Please silence or turn off other electronic devices that could cause a disruption to your sound feed. I'm going to review the process for members seeking recognition in a virtual meeting format. The Microsoft Teams chat function is disabled for this meeting. Members are encouraged to use the raise hand function or signal to the chair for recognition. I'll maintain the discussion queue and ask Vice Chair Young to assist me in keeping track of all of our digitally raised hands so everybody has an opportunity to speak. I'm going to open this meeting by reading the Kentucky Board of Education mission statement. To improve the future of all Kentucky learners by providing leadership, advocating for resources, advancing policy, and cultivating community partnerships to ensure each and every student has equitable access to high quality, lifelong learning. Now I will ask Dr. Jones to please call the roll.
Thank you, Chair Robinson. Members, please state your name and say present when your name is called. Holly Bloodworth.
Holly Bloodworth, present.
Harold McKinney.
Harold McKinney, present.
Justin Pate. Julie Pyle.
Julie Pyle, present.
Randy Poe. Chair Sharon Porter Robinson.
Sharon Porter Robinson, present.
Lee Todd.
Lee Todd, present.
Steve Trimble.
Steve Trimble, present.
Vice Chair Lou Young.
Lou Young, present.
Harper Blake.
Harper Blake, present.
Alfonso de Torres Nunez.
Alfonso de Torres Nunez, present.
Secretary Jamie Link.
Amy Link is present.
President Aaron Thompson. Chair, you do have a quorum.
Thank you. At our August 2025 retreat, the board adopted our 2026 calendar, which reflects additional regular meetings for the purpose of conducting board work sessions. These meetings are being held virtually in odd number months and will allow for board member learning and discussion. Members were asked to provide input on meeting topics, and members submitted questions in advance, which allowed the Kentucky Board of Education staff, Department of Education staff, to prepare materials to help inform today's discussions. These materials were provided in the board meeting packet for your review and posted in the KSBA meeting portal prior to today's meeting. During our December meeting, it was requested that the board continue discussions related to Kentucky student achievement. This item is scheduled for our February regular meeting. Based on members' interest, today's agenda, however, will be sort of a tutorial and focus on financial matters and authority related to the Kentucky Board of Education. I now welcome Commissioner Fletcher to introduce today's learning focus and the presenters who will help guide our conversation.
Thanks so much, Chair Robinson. Getting used to this, to an online meeting again, so it's really good for us to be here today. But also following input from our board chairs, today's presentations are focused specifically on the board's authority over budget and contracts, as well as school district funding and financial reporting to the Kentucky Board of Education. Deputy Commissioner and General Counsel Todd Allen will start today's discussion, followed by Associate Commissioner Matt Ross and Division Director Che Ritter and Policy Advisor Lindsay Swartz from the KDE Office of Finance and Operations. Busy time for all of us, but especially when it comes to finance and operations. As Chair Robinson noted, today's meeting is intended to focus on the board's learning agenda. Again, this is going to be very much a tutorial of as it relates to finances here at the department. And questions are encouraged. Please keep that in mind as we go through. Dr. Jones will email an exit slip after today's meeting to provide board members with further opportunity to seek clarification on any information or address questions you may have based on today's discussion. I feel like my math teacher with those exit slips again, so I'm looking forward to that. All comments and questions are welcome, and Dr. Jones will coordinate the necessary follow-up with our department staff. I now invite Deputy Commissioner Todd Allen to present on the KBE's authority over budgets and contracts.
Thank you, Commissioner, and good afternoon, board members. It's a pleasure to be here with you this afternoon. I have prepared a presentation to go over the state board's authority over the department's budgets and contracts here at KDE. I've also prepared for you all a memorandum that is loaded into the secure portion of your portal. That memorandum does contain legal analysis and recommendations, so it will remain confidential because it's protected by the attorney-client privilege. That's for board members only. Our goal, I know, today and this afternoon is to get through the presentation and to allow time for robust conversations among the board members. So I will try my best to move through these slides relatively quickly. Feel free, however, as has been indicated, to stop me at any time and ask questions along the way. Next slide, please. So here, the best place to start is with the statutory authority of the State Board of Education over budgets and contracts. And as you'll see, the statutory authority really gives the board an option to either set policy on contracts and budgets for the department or to act on all of the budgets and contracts for the department. That is a little bit different than you see with local boards of education, but it does allow the board the flexibility to determine how it wants to tackle contracts and budgets for the department. Next slide. We'll start by talking about budgets, and then later on in the presentation, we'll move to contracts. Here is the state board's authority related to the executive branch budget. And you'll see that in essence, it is the board's responsibility to review the budget of the Department of Education and then to make recommendations to the governor on any changes that the board may wish to see in the budget for the Department of Education. And I've provided there for you. As you all know, we do a biennial budget. So whenever we receive a budget from the General Assembly, absent strange circumstances, it would be for 2 years. And the timeline there is provided to you that department staff presented to the board on the department's budget. You see the capital budget, our baseline budget and defined calculations, and then finally in August of 2025, the additional budget requests that the board reviewed and approved. Next slide, please. So once the state board reviews the budget and makes recommendations to the governor, the department staff here compiles that information and sends it to the Office of State Budget Director, whose job it is to put all of that information together and provide it to the governor. The Department of Education receives 3 separate budget units through the General Assembly once they approve a budget, and we refer to them as SEEK, BOSS, and LARS. And we'll talk a little bit about each of those. If you go to the next slide. SEEK by far is the largest amount of money that is appropriated to the department. I have a screenshot there from the General Assembly's budget bill that tells you how much is appropriated in each biennium to the department. But the thing to remember about SEEK is that there's no discretion to the department in how this is distributed. This is completely a calculation that KDE runs and distributes all of this money to school districts. None of it is retained at KDE for its own operations. You'll see there in the bullets on the slide that there are a few additional instructions that we may receive based on budgets in different years on how we run that SEEK calculation. But for purposes of our presentation, I just wanted to note here, SEEK is the largest amount of money, and we distribute all of it out to school districts. Matt and his staff will discuss a little bit more about that in their portion of the presentation after me. Next slide, please. So then we have BOSS, Operation and Support Services. I'm not quite sure where the B came from. I think maybe at one point in time it was called Branch Operation and Support Services, but we still refer to it as BOSS. And this is really the money that the department receives for operations here at KDE. And you'll see that it's broken down in the General Assembly's budget by general funds, those are state funds, restricted funds, and then federal funds. So the Office of State Budget Director is estimating the amount of federal funds KDE is going to get as well, and the General Assembly includes that in its appropriation to KDE. I have that red arrow on the slide just for you to keep that number in mind, 549,418,000, because you'll see it again just to tie these pieces together for you. Next slide, please. We get some special instructions in the BOSS budgeting unit. You can see there the top bullet is related to employment of leadership personnel, and the State Board of Education is specifically mentioned. The KBE has the sole authority to determine the KDE employees that are exempt from the classified service and to set their compensation comparable to the competitive market. The last time the State Board did that was October of 2021. Some of you may remember that we did a survey for the competitive market salaries, and the board set a salary schedule for exempt employees at that point in time. And then I won't go through the rest of the bullets, but you see just some details about special instructions that we get on how we have to spend some of the BOSS appropriation. Money for debt service, for residential travel for blind and deaf students, for school food service, AP exams, things of that nature. A large portion there for educator liability insurance that we have to pay here at the state level. Next slide, please. So here are those red arrows again, and you see that that's the exact same number that we talked about previously that was included in the General Assembly's budget bill. And I want to call this to your attention because once the General Assembly passes a budget, then we await the Office of State Budget Director to give to KDE an operating budget for those matters. So you see we go into more detail here. We get expenditures by class that tells us how much can be used for personnel costs, for operating costs, for grants that we're going to give out, whether it's to school districts or some other grantees, for debt service. Expenditures by fund source, that was the same thing that was provided in the General Assembly's budget. But then I would also note there expenditures by unit. It also tells us how we have to spend the money within each of the units within the department. I've put a star there beside my office, and we'll use it kind of as the guinea pig for our conversation. You'll see the amount that is totally appropriated that the Office of State Budget Director has indicated we can spend in the Office of Legal Services for each of the years. Next slide, please. So then for each of those budgeting units, notice this is for the Office of Legal Services. We get even further instructions from the Office of State Budget Director in how we can spend that total appropriation. And I would point you down to the expenditures by class about 3/4 of the way down the screen. It tells me in the office, it tells the commissioner exactly how much we can spend for personnel costs within the Office of Legal Services. That's $1.4 million. And how much we have for operating expenses. That's $31,000 per year. So I just want to bring that to the board's attention. We see that much larger number in the General Assembly's state budget bill, but KDE receives from the Office of State Budget Director these much more specific instructions. There really isn't a lot of discretion here to determine what those numbers are, because the Office of State Budget Director gives those to us. Next slide, please. Next, we have LARS, that's Learning and Results Services. That's a larger appropriation to KDE. So once again, this is a screenshot from the General Assembly's budget bill. It shows us what's appropriated to KDE in general funds, restricted funds, and federal funds. Next slide. And same process exists here. The state budget director sends to us a more detailed operating budget for the Learning and Results Services item. It is too long for me to have posted all of it in one slide here, but I have taken a screenshot that shows you, federal funds, restricted funds, and general funds, how that's broken down by source from the Office of State Budget Director. Next slide. And then, of course, the expenditures by unit. And you'll see some units here that correspond to offices at KDE, our Office of Continuous Improvement and Support, our Office of Special Education and Early Learning, tells us exactly how much we can spend within those offices. And then for each of those units, they also have one of those specific breakdowns, like I showed you earlier for my own office, that talks about how much can be spent for personnel costs, how much can be spent for operating expenses. They don't all necessarily correspond to offices within KDE. The second to last one there, local district health and life insurance. Of course, KDE has to make those payments on behalf of school districts. So you see a very large number there that is appropriated to us for that purpose. I will note that the budget bill contains language, if it's in your mind, about moving money around from one budget unit to the next. The department can request to the Office of State Budget Director to move up to 5% from one budget unit to another. And if the Office of State Budget Director approves that, then we can move up to 5% between one budget unit to the next. But again, there isn't a lot of discretion to the department, to the commissioner, or even to the board when it comes to these budgets that are provided to us by the State Budget Director's office. Next slide, please. So got a quick summary here to talk about budget. KBE reviews and approves the KDE budget request. The General Assembly passes a budget with appropriations to the department. The Office of State Budget Director provides a budget detailing expenditures by fund, source, class, and working unit. And then KDE must operate within the budget prescribed by the Office of State Budget Director, as well as the funding source conditions. So I want to note that very often with federal funds specifically, we have very specific conditions that we must meet in how we spend that money. In general, again, just noting here that there's rather limited discretion left to the commissioner on how to expend that money. So that concludes budgeting. I'll pause for just a moment to see if there are any questions about budgets before we move on to contracts. Chair Robinson, I think you're muted.
I'm asking my fellow board members if there are questions or comments. Todd, just assure me that the budgeting for the administrative units, though it's not exactly aligned with the actual structure right now, but that is done in consultation with the Office of the Budget Director for the state, right?
Absolutely. That is absolutely correct.
Any other questions?
Yeah, I had a question. I guess, Todd, when you're saying, okay, this is the budget, and you're going to be moving over to contracts, that's something separate. But on the budget, I guess, and my question has been in the past, and, simple question is, I know we, according to all the memos that you gave and other things, and attorney-client privilege we can't go into, but we give that authority to the commissioner. But that authority, by giving that authority to the commissioner to oversee, does not limit us to asking questions on the effectiveness of those particular budgets. I mean, that was my question back in December. So with
Sure.
this, I mean, because I don't want people, you know, it seems like if, you know, it's all or nothing that we're hearing, but it shouldn't be all or nothing in asking questions as a board back on how this was spent. Was it wise, you know, and the effectiveness and the return on investment of how that was spent, correct? Or help me out on that for understanding.
Yeah, absolutely, Dr. Poe. I think I would agree with you. And I think that your comment probably applies, or at least could be tied a little bit more directly to contracts
Yes.
and the overall budget, right? We get a budget from the General
Right.
Assembly and the
Yeah.
state budget director that tells us how to spend the money. But I think your comment and question may be a little bit more tied to the efficacy or the return, the deliverables on a particular contract that the department may enter into. And absolutely, board members are free to ask questions and get information about those.
Okay, thank you.
For the record, Dr. Jones, please note that Dr. Poe has joined us and contributed at this point.
So noted. Thank you.
Other questions?
I see one from Ms. Bloodworth.
Yes, Holly.
Yes, so just a quick clarifying question. On the liability insurance for educators, is that paid to the schools and the schools have that insurance, or what is that? What does that look like?
So statute requires that school districts maintain liability insurance for educators at a certain level that they pay for themselves as a first line of coverage. And then it requires the state, KDE, to solicit bids and enter into a contract with an excess insurer. So in the event that the underlying coverage that's paid for and provided by the school district isn't sufficient to cover some judgment against a teacher, then the policy that's procured by KDE to cover all teachers in the state would kick in at that point in time. It's two levels.
Okay. And if they have a suit or something that we're involved in, is it a conflict of interest, like against their insurance versus?
Well, so the suit would be against an educator for some type of negligence, alleged negligence, and then they would need to notify their insurance carriers, which primary would be the one provided by their local school district employer, and then secondary would be the one provided by the state.
Thank you.
Okay. I don't see any other questions, so I'll move on to the contract portion of the presentation. So I have here just a note that unlike local boards of education, which must act on all the contracts for the school district, the state board, again, going back to that statute that we discussed earlier on, can either establish policy or act on all contracts. Looking back, in order to put together the memo that I provided to you all in this presentation, looking back to the Education Reform Act in 1990, which established the Office of the Commissioner of Education for the first time. Since that time, the State Board of Education has established and followed the policy of delegating contracting authority to the commissioner. KDE enters into approximately 400 to 500 contracts each year, looking at volume there. Next slide, please. Here, I wanted to note for the board members, provide an explanation of the various processes and laws that we have to comply with for all of the contracts that we enter into here at KDE. So while that authority has been delegated to the commissioner to enter into contracts, there are a lot of laws, policies, and regulations that he and KDE have to comply with as a state agency. And the first is compliance with the Kentucky Model Procurement Act. Here, the Finance Administration Cabinet ensures that all agencies are complying with the Model Procurement Act by reviewing each and every contract that we enter into. And they either approve or deny those. They're looking to determine that we have in fact complied with the Model Procurement Act. The Model Procurement Act is passed by the General Assembly. It's contained in KRS Chapter 45A. The Finance Cabinet has then put in place its own purchasing regulations as well as procurement policies, and we have to comply with all of those. The Model Procurement Act or Model Procurement Code may be something that you have heard of before. We have a large portion of school districts in Kentucky that have opted into the Model Procurement Act. However, state law provides that when a local school district opts into the Model Procurement Act, they're only opting into a portion of the requirements of that act, whereas KDE has to comply with the entirety of the Model Procurement Code. Of course, it's designed to ensure that there's fairness and competition in our contracting and purchasing, that there's standardization, and that there is transparency. As part of those policies that the Finance and Administration Cabinet puts in place, KDE staff here that are responsible for receiving, reviewing, scoring proposals, they have to sign non-disclosure agreements for every contract that they review that's provided to them by the Finance and Administration Cabinet, and it prohibits them from disclosing any information about the proposals that they receive throughout that process. And of course, that is designed to guarantee fairness and competition in the process. If our staff were to publicly announce who may be bidding on a contract, that may influence other people who would come to the table and bid on it or not bid on it for that matter. So we want to ensure that we're complying with all of those requirements. Of course, once the process is completed and a contract is entered into, that is, of course, public record. That's published on publicly available websites to show all of the contracts that KDE enters into. And final note about the Model Procurement Act, for those of you, the board has had one exception that I can recall, in that whenever we have solicited services for a national search firm to search for a commissioner, in the past, the board has wanted to be involved in that process. So for those of you who served on that committee in the past, you probably recall some of the requirements of the Model Procurement Act, the meetings that we held, the confidentiality agreements that were assigned, a lot of the process involved there. Next slide, please. KDE, all of our contracts are also subject to review by the Government Contract Review Committee. This is a legislative committee that is set up to meet every month to review every state agency contract. And I have the statutory authority listed there for you, but in essence, they have the authority to examine whether the service could or should be performed by state personnel instead of the vendor that is selected. Whether the amount and duration of the contract or agreement is appropriate, and the appropriateness of any exchange of resources or responsibilities between the Commonwealth and the vendor. KDE appears before the Government Contract Review Committee on a monthly basis and answers any questions that may be raised about our agency contracts. They do not pull every contract, every KDE contract for review, but the way the process works is they get a list of every contract that every agency has entered into from the Finance and Administration Cabinet, and then in advance of the meeting decide which contracts they want to call staff to actually speak to. If the Government Contract Review Committee finds that the contract should not go into effect for any reason, then the matter is forwarded to the Finance Cabinet Secretary to make a final determination whether or not the contract will go into effect. Next slide. And then finally, on the back end, of course, we have external audits, and KDE is subject to quite a few audits over the course of any given year. Any entity that receives federal funds of $750,000 or more annually must have a single audit. And of course, KDE undergoes that through the Statewide Single Audit of Kentucky, also known as the SWAC. We are also subject to program audits by the U.S. Department of Education, U.S. Department of Agriculture, Office of Education Accountability, and other entities that are looking at KDE's operations. So not just financial audits, but also programmatic compliance audits. And of course, the APA has additional audit authority to audit any entity at other times as may be deemed expedient by the Auditor of Public Accounts. KDE staff report those audit results to the KBE on a routine basis, and I have a link there to you. The last time that we reported on audits was June 2025 to provide the KBE with results from our audits. Next slide. Okay, as promised, hopefully I moved through that relatively quickly and provided a level of background knowledge on the topic. I'm happy to answer any questions. And then, of course, Chair Robinson, any discussion that the board wishes to undergo on this topic.
Great. So given the volume of contracts, it seems that our established policy position is not just prudent. So are there questions? I mean, it seems that we're in the right position for, and we understand more about the constructs for accountability. Now, what further questions might there be? Julie, you muted.
Yeah, I think I just unmuted. So thank you, Todd, because what you just showed that there's like 3, 4, 5 layers for the contracts to have to go through, which that's very comforting to know that there's so many eyes being reviewed in the process. I really appreciated that. 2 questions I had was when contracts go to agencies like our co-ops, are the same procedures followed, multiple layers of review and audits afterwards and those kind of things for those kind of agencies?
Yes. So for partners like co-ops, there are different types of contracts that exist. So we could have, for example, a personal service contract that would have to go out to bid. There are memorandums of agreement that under the Model Procurement Act, the agency can enter into a memorandum of agreement, also a type of contract, with a nonprofit entity like a co-op or a university without going through the bidding process. However, they still must go into the system to be reviewed and approved by the Finance Cabinet and are subject to review by the Government Contract Review Committee and would be subject to audit as well.
Okay. And then another question, which ties a little bit back to Holly's question, when you talked about excess coverage for the professional liability, is there, and when the school districts have property insurance and say they don't have enough coverage, even though I believe there's a law with how much they're supposed to maintain, what happens? Is there a similar thing? Does our department have excess coverage for property if school districts don't?
No.
Or no? Okay.
No, there is no excess coverage, property and casualty coverage at the state level, because that's not been mandated to us. That's really a situation where the board has a regulation in place that tells school districts how much property insurance they have to have for a loss such as a fire, tornado, something of that nature. And the state audit standards, where an independent auditor goes in and audits the books of a school district each year, part of that audit guide indicates that they should be checking the adequacy of insurance coverage that the district has in place. Now, to answer your question about a catastrophic situation, let's say that something did occur and the coverage was not sufficient. In that situation, the school district would be looking to the General Assembly really to appropriate funds to them to fill the gap. But there is no additional coverage.
Okay, thank you.
Randy? You're on mute.
Okay, yeah, Todd, the question I have, it goes back to what you were saying earlier. So on the Reform Act, we it's all or nothing. The Kentucky Board of Education does not have the choice like school districts, you said, if I'm understanding this correctly. So when a statute says specifically that the Kentucky Board of Education must approve X, Y, or Z, that means that it falls back under the Reform Act, or are those two statutes in disagreement with each other?
I'm not sure that I would agree, Dr. Poe, that it's all or nothing. So for example, I think that the board's decision to be involved in the solicitation review and selecting a vendor for a nationwide search firm for the commissioner is a fine example of that. The board's policy overall is that they're going to delegate contracting authority to the commissioner, but they made a determination that in that situation, since they were soliciting services of a search firm to work for them to hire a commissioner, they wanted to do that work. So I don't necessarily think that it's all or nothing. Is that answering the question?
Well, well, it gets me back to a gray area, I guess.
Okay.
You know, I mean, one of the questions that I've had in the past is, you know, how did this come about without us knowing about something or whatever? And that's going back to that we can't signal out that we want to be responsible for 5 things. When I'm reading that memo, we don't have the choice. It was either all or nothing. You can't choose to be in charge of, or the board say to the commissioner that here's 5 things coming up that we want to know about. And then the 455 other things that fall under the other statute. I thought you said it was all or nothing. That's what.
No, I don't think that's the case. I think that the board could make a determination that they want to, be the ones to approve certain types of contracts if that's the board's prerogative. Now, I would also note that the statute anticipates a level of cooperation between the commissioner and the board. It talks about upon recommendation of the commissioner to the board, how this is going to work. Maybe where we're talking about all or nothing, Randy, is once KDE begins the process of soliciting, going through a solicitation under the Model Procurement Act, we can't share information about that. We can't make that public until it's complete. It is
Correct.
a confidential process that everybody involved, has to sign non-disclosure. That was the same situation if we go back to that selecting a search firm, right? The board decided early on that it wanted to be involved. It selected people to be involved, but those individuals had to sign non-disclosure agreements. They couldn't talk about who the alternate vendors were, who the non-selected vendors were, things of that nature.
I guess moving forward, and the follow-up question, and that'll be my last question on this topic, is can you then at a point in time in the future tell us what statutes specifically say this is our authority to do versus just that the board? Because there are some I think that's where it comes into play, is there are some statutes out there that says the board must approve X. And if we say we're giving this authority to the commissioner as a process, I'm not sure that we're meeting that. I don't know. That's where you as lawyers come into play, but I think that's where the questions that I didn't understand. So I'd just like to know what things are specifically laid out in statute that we are responsible to make a board decision on versus abrogating that duty to the commissioner.
Okay. I'm not aware of any that the board has not fulfilled that responsibility. If there's something specific in statute that we talk about, the board has an obligation to do. Really that's what we're doing here in the Office of Legal Services internally, is saying, hey, this is something that has to go to the board for a decision to be made. I'll
give you the example that we've been, for the last 6 months dealing with. It was appealed, and I'm not asking about the appeal process or anything, But the statute where we selected, a testing vendor, one over the other, that statute clearly has that the Kentucky Board of Education must approve the vendor based on the following conditions. And it was very clear that it says the Kentucky Board of Education must approve, not shall approve or anything, but must approve. So I guess that's the one if you can look at and then explain to that at sometime in the future, how that's different from what we're talking about of picking one out versus the other of major circumstances.
Yeah, I'm happy to look at that, Randy. I would want to pull the language and provide, but
Yeah.
I don't think that the statute provides that the board is to approve a testing vendor, but we'll look at it.
It said that there's X conditions that must be met, and then the Board of Education would approve it afterwards. So that was the one. And then I had asked that at a board meeting at one point in time, and I thought that was, we went back to that it was all or nothing. So that's what I would like clarification in the future on.
Sure.
Thank you.
Julie, I see your hand up.
I think Dr. Fletcher is before me.
Oh, Commissioner?
Oh, thank you, Chair Robinson. I wanted to follow up with Julie, with Board Member Pyle's question. Also, too, once there's a contract, like for example, a memorandum of agreement or something of that nature that's within the department, it goes through a routing process. There's at least 6 or 7 other folks that sign off before I see it. For example, there's the submitter, the document reviewer, and then you have the division director that also reviews it. You have the associate commissioner that also reviews the agreement. And then it goes to the budget director and also to general counsel before it comes to me for my approval too. So those contracts, those memorandums of agreement, they go through a routing process, even internally, to have multiple eyes on them even before I see them for final approval.
Julie?
Yeah, I guess I'm relating a lot of times when the state board stuff, I relate back to when I was on our local school board. And I relate this back to, we had passed a policy because our board agendas were getting huge because of all the contracts coming through. They were like triple letters, that we set a policy in place that our superintendent up to a certain dollar amount could approve contracts without them coming to the board. But what we had done to kind of help with a little bit of oversight of that was we would receive a list of all the contracts he did approve, and then we could ask questions on those type of things. So I think I'm a lot of times at the state level, I'm trying to relate it to what we did on the local level to see what the similar processes are.
So understanding that we are operating first within the framework of a state procurement model that is in fact governing, that's the first thing we've got to kind of get our heads around. And then I think we need to round back to the question of contract deliverables and the outcomes and the results that we are seeking more information about. Lou?
I was scratching my nose, so sorry.
I'm board members, I'm trying to kind of keep note of the remaining hanging issues here. I mean, this is good information and it grounds us, puts us all on the same playing field, so to speak. And so we will continue to perfect our sense of fulfilling our obligation as it relates to accountability in every respect. So with that, I'm going to thank Todd for setting us up for a really informative discussion that also produced questions, which is just right from the education, from the as we are learners here. It's we appreciate the effort and getting us started. I'm now going to invite Matt Ross, Che Ritter, and Lindsay Swartz from the Office of Finance and Operations to present on school district funding, financial reporting to the KBE. Matt?
Thank you. I appreciate it. And thank you, Todd. He did a really good job of covering a lot of what my office does within budgets and contracting. Of course, if you have additional questions that you think my office can help with, please reach out to me, and we'll do our best to answer those questions. So we'll shift a little bit of gears, sort of away from the state agency to sort of school district funding and financial reporting. This is probably the most comprehensive presentation we put together on this subject. Some of you will have seen pieces and parts. Some of you are probably more familiar with it than others. So we have done our best to put together a really good presentation that hits on all these topics that we've talked about before. But our goal here is to break it down and make it digestible and understandable, knowing that it's a pretty thick subject, pretty thick topic. So we definitely invite questions. I've asked, Che's going to take the lion's share of this because he's been working on some new stand-up. So hopefully it'll be entertaining too. But I've asked him to really take some time on sort of the topics that we say really quickly. We say little phrases, little terms of art, and we say them really quickly, but they have a big import, right? So I really wanted to take the time to sort of break those down and go through them and let you all have the opportunity to react to them and to ask questions, so that we can, do our best to enlighten everybody. And, we may learn something about how we do these presentations going forward. This is sort of like a supersized version of our road show that we did. A lot of you heard about last year. So we'll do our best to keep it engaging and entertaining. But please feel free to ask questions. Anybody, slow us down, stop us if we hit something, and I'll do my best to interject where I think we do sometimes. We run over topics too quickly that I think really we need to stop and pause and think a minute on. So with that, I'll turn it over to the infamous Che Ritter.
Thank you, Matt. I appreciate it. Glip just said I have till 9 o'clock tonight to finish this. I'm really excited. And like Matt said, we revamped, I think, maybe 2 or 3 different presentations we've done in the past. I couldn't tell you how many of these presentations in my career, but each time we do it, I always look at my audience and think, if I was sitting in their seat, what would I ask, or what would I not know? So if we talk about something quickly and you just can't understand what it is, by all means, raise your hand and let us know. We're glad to slow it down and explain this, because this gets, like Matt said, it gets pretty thick, and we jump back and forth between what districts are doing, what we're doing here at the state, and the big picture, the smaller picture. And we'll talk a little bit about, things that are sort of on the fringe of this. Very important, but still we don't talk about a lot when we talk about school funding, or like the local budgeting process and things like that. That's not my process, so I don't speak a lot about it, but those come to you for approval. I think in the last couple of board meetings, we had those come to you all for approval. So we always like to start really high level. What goes into this public school funding in Kentucky? Of course, federal, we've got U.S. Department of Ed money, USDA, U.S. Department of Labor. There's a lot of federal grants out there, and that's a reasonably big chunk of money. But in the past couple of years, we had ESSER funding too. So that sort of changed, sort of the pie chart, if you will, when you look at it in totality, how much federal money were we getting as a state. Then we'll talk a lot today about the state funding, which is that middle upper box there. And we're going to talk some about that local taxing authority and what that means. And I always tell school board members, local school board members, I should say, that you have one tool in your toolbox to generate money. and it's taxes. You don't have another tool. You don't have, many different sources of revenue that are just like fruit on a tree. You got one thing you can do, and that's local taxes. And it's really, really important that they use that tool wisely and efficiently and all of that. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. Of course, under KDE, many of you all are familiar in the blue box there about on behalf payments. You hear on behalf quite a bit because it's a sizable chunk of money. It goes towards our retirement, teachers retirement system, the KEN network, which David Couch can speak to, and health and life insurance. But it never really hits the shores of the district. It comes through Karen Worth's office and my office, and we end up paying, directly to the appropriate state agencies to cover that. And that's an appropriation in our budget bill that we get from the General Assembly. Of course, we have the Kentucky School for the Blind, Kentucky School for the Deaf, and we just updated this, about 50 ATCs, and that's under KDE's umbrella. And again, when you start talking about grants, federal, state, and you'll notice the state grants, there's KETS, Flex Focus, which you hear Karen Worth talk about quite a bit over her presentations. And there's line items, federal grants, Perkins, IDEA, all the title grants. And when you get finally down into what I call the deepest weeds of funding, you get into SBDM. And for those of you that have been on the local district side, that's a very familiar thing to most of those for either former board members or parents. That SBDM is definitely a Kentucky thing, but this is where it all sort of trickles down to once it runs through the KDE and eventually, all the way down to the SBDM. And then, of course, your local board, if you look on the far right, that's where they get into property taxes, utility taxes, occupational in some cases. We can go to the next slide, please. All right, so we want context more than anything, and we not terribly long ago were asked to come speak to a committee at the General Assembly about what was spent on education K through 12 in Kentucky. And when you start adding everything up, it gets a little complicated, but we went back to FY24 and federal revenue was almost $2 billion. Not quite 2 billion, but pretty close. State revenue about 2.5, so pretty sizable. But when you add that on behalf that I mentioned, that was for teachers' retirement, health insurance, and that network, that's another $2 billion. So if you're looking at state money, that's about $4.5 to $4.6 billion right off the top. There's some other state revenues, which would include those grants that Karen Worth's shop deals with. It's $631 million. And then we look at the local side. You've got local taxes as $3.5 billion. Most of that is property taxes. And each of us, we get that nice birthday card from the county clerk about your car tax being due. Some of that tax goes right to the schools into that $3.5 billion. And so that's a sizable portion of this. And if you keep breaking it down, there's another chunk of local revenue, and this comes through fees and some other money that they generate locally. But overall, we're north of $11 billion. Now, from a state budget perspective, if you just look at three state sections there, SEEK, on behalf, and other state revenues, that's a pretty sizable chunk of our state budget on its own. And, when you're looking at, again, the totality and the context of this, $11.2 billion going to K through 12, it's sizable, no matter how you cut it up. We can go to the next slide, please. So this is basically, how as a state we've, appropriated these funds. But I want to add a very, very big, large caveat. This is not reflective of each individual district's experience. And I'll explain a little bit more about that in great detail a little bit further into the slides. But what we wanted to do is we basically went down to the very bottom of our, all the districts, add these up, what percentage is state, what percentage is local, what percentage is federal, and then we've got some other. But the state share as a state total is still very significant, but the local is also very significant. These are the two, obviously, the largest chunks of revenue that our school districts get. And without even looking, I'd be pretty comfortable placing a bet that if we went back 10 years and looked at this, the state share has probably hovered in the 40% range, but that local share has grown probably at a little bit faster rate than the state has. The local taxes generally become very important, and you'll see this in your local paper quite frequently when they want to do raises, when they want to, do things in the district. They will, usually reach into their own pocket. The districts that are on the larger side, like JCPS, Fayette County, your Boone, your Campbell, Warren County, typically, they've got a sort of different set of needs because either A, they grow, or their size creates a little bit different issues for them. I always remember JCPS telling me, how many buses they buy each year. It's a very sizable number. They're a very large district. So their local needs may require them to, increase those local taxes in order to pay for teacher raises and things like that. Or if you're Warren County and you grow very fast and you're picking up 200-300 students a year, you're going to have different facility needs, which may require you to levy higher taxes to build these buildings. So I think I want to be really emphasize that, a district like maybe a Wolfe County or a Clay County would get more from the state and less locally from local taxes. But when you go to, I'll take Fayette County, they're going to generate more locally than they get from the state. And it's generally because of property wealth, and we'll talk about that. Now, if you're interested in jumping deeper into those weeds, I really do recommend it because I think it's fascinating to see the difference between districts. Our school report card has that information on it. And we can also, if you have questions later, we're always glad to, look at your districts in your backyard and kind of say, here's what these look like, percentage wide. Pretty easy for us to put that together pretty quickly. You can go to the next slide, please. So as some of you are aware, in the fall, late fall, we bring you all working budgets from the school districts. And as a part of that budgeting process, I've always, kind of laughed because it never stops for the local school districts. Actually got a call on this the other day from a large district. They're already starting their draft of a draft, basically. So by May 30th, which will be here, soon, they need to have a tentative budget put together. And, this one comes to the department. However, it's the working budget, which is a lot more firm, if you will. It's sort of refined with revenues and expenditures, and it's going to be more realistic. And that comes to us by September 30th. And then we pack that up and bring it to you all for approval. And I think that approval is in 160, 470 as a statute. That approval has been in place for quite a long time. This is a really important process that local districts go through with their board. This, puts their sales in the right direction. Staffing levels are determined here. They may do staffing cuts. They may have to trim back some purchases like buses. But there's always a lot of emphasis on this process at the local district. We get quite a few calls and questions, but imagine being a local board member, which some of you all have experienced that, and you need to do, or at least think you need to do teacher raises or staff raises, and your seat's going to be flat. This is, you're like, we need to build in some revenue for these raises. This is kind of where it's done. And this is where you map all that out. This is a plan like any budget, and, down into late fall, winter, deep winter, which certainly doesn't feel like it today, but they may have to make adjustments as they go and budget amendments. They may need a bus, they may not. And kind of best laid plans of MICE and local school boards. So we can go to the next slide, please. So at the end of each fiscal year, we get two annual financial reports. One is unaudited, That comes to us generally by July 25th. And we generally use this one to calculate some tax rate information, but it's important. This one is sort of that, rough draft. They may not have all their ducks in a row on this version. But when that auditor comes, and he or she is an independent certified public accountant or an auditor that will come in there. And there's an audit contract, which is available on our website, and they will go through and look at, the way the district spent. They'll look for, some weakness in processes, or they'll also look to make sure the district was compliant with statutes. You're certainly welcome to read through the audit contract. It's pretty lengthy, but it's also pretty interesting. There's a lot of little intricate things they have to do as a district. They've got to publish certain items. That's in statute. But that auditor will be there quite a while working with the district, and then they will eventually submit and publish an audited annual financial report, which about 10 feet from me right now, that's what the staff are working on. It takes a while to get all these in. We don't have a lot of independent auditors who do school audits anymore. I think it's sort of a cottage industry at this point. But it's a really, really integral part of, I think, our universe is to have an independent auditor go in there. These auditors also help the finance officers of these districts, because there may be questions about, I have a very specific situation I need some assistance with. I move this money and here's what we're trying to do. And they want to make sure that the books are in good shape. If they do have findings, those are reported to the local board. We also review those findings if they're significant or if it's a repeat finding, for example. And as Todd mentioned earlier, and I always explain this to many, many people, we're also audited. It's a little bit different for us. Typically, my office is audited by the state auditor's office each and every year. But if they do find something, we address that. We may or may not agree with their finding, but in the years past, they found a process that they said, it's not weak, but it could use some improvement. We agreed with it and we changed it. It's a good process. It's nice to have another set of eyes look at stuff that you do each and every day. You can go to the next slide, please.
Hang on just a second, Shay.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
I'll just reference that. So when Todd mentioned earlier about property insurance, the question about property insurance and adequacy, this is the audit where that would be reviewed and looked at.
Yeah.
And then this is also something we report to you, sort of the outcome of all the audits. So in December, I think we reported to you that there were so many audits that were found to be acceptable or deficient or technically deficient. So we report to you sort of the outcomes of those, and that when the corrections have made so that they become acceptable. But that is an item that we do bring to you all so that you are aware.
Yeah, thank you, Matt. You can go to the next slide, please. So one thing that will eventually make its way to you all in the sort of latter part of the year, and you've seen these a couple of times, are tax rates from school districts. In every community, your local school district, the board has the authority to levy certain types of taxes. And this, as we mentioned earlier, is a significant part of the revenue. And those taxes are applied to real estate, tangible or personal property. And tangible property is basically anything that's not real estate. If you think of a manufacturer who's got equipment and desk and things like that, they go through and there's a value attached to those. They also tax motor vehicles, of course, and there's also aircraft, watercraft. And to clarify on the watercraft, this type is actually the large Coast Guard registered vessels, typically on a river, big lake. Obviously, they tax your neighbor's bass boat and pontoon as well at the local clerk's office. Those rates are set by the local board once a year, and it's a process. And there's a lot of, I think, stress put on that process by the local boards. In some communities, the public pays very close attention to it. In other communities, it's kind of a pretty sleepy process. Dr. Fletcher came out of a district. They had some needs. They put it out there and the community got kind of riled up. That's happened across the state in some cases. I know some of our former superintendents can speak to that a lot better than I can. And in other communities, it's just kind of a, ho-hum. It's another tax rate. And then all of a sudden somebody gets worked up and they'll show up at a board meeting. So this, like I said, is a really important part of the local school board process. This is how they control their local revenue. Very, very important decision. You can go to the next slide, please. So on the real estate and tangible personal property side, we do 4 calculations in my office. And the process is a little strange. We're getting a certified property assessment from the Department of Revenue for each school district. They kind of come in waves to us, so we don't get them all at once. These are actually numbers from the local PVA. The Department of Revenue does their magic and certifies it, and they send it to us. We take those plus some other financial information. We do four tax rates. The local school board may, at their option, adopt a different tax rate, and it's just known as other. It's just not one we've calculated. And then eventually they'll submit those tax rates to us. We review them, and then we bring them to you all. Usually, I think it's over about 3 different board meetings. It takes a while to get them all in. As a matter of fact, we have some coming to the next board meeting, and we still have, I think, one outstanding because there's some legal issues with it. They're in court, I believe. So it takes a while to get all these in. It is a pretty lengthy process for some districts that if they're doing a recallable tax rate. And for others, they can adopt it relatively quickly and be done with it. So it varies year to year. And some years you'll notice districts, property assessments are really moving up, tax rates go down a little bit. You'll notice many districts are, trying to take a rate that gives them the 4%, which you see on your screen. And other years where maybe they've taken 4% a few times in a row, they may lower that down a little bit and kind of turn the volume down and do compensating. So it varies by district. I don't know if there's a science to it, and we've never really seen a pattern, but some districts' tax rates are obviously higher than others. Independents are generally going to be higher just because of the property they can tax. They don't have the bigger areas they can tax or as many vehicles. So with that, we see the numbers come in, and you can see those when we submit them to you at, like I said, usually it's the last 2 or 3 board meetings of the calendar year. We can go to the next.
Jay, to
Oh, yeah,
add
go
to
ahead.
that, if I don't mind,
Mhm.
whether or not the property assessments go up for a year is typically a big factor on whether or not a local board will decide to take the compensating versus the 4%. If you and those numbers too. So that does make an impact. If property values go up or they go down, then what happens there? So, like for example, if property values go down, the compensating rate may increase.
Yeah.
Or should increase, as a matter of fact, if the property values go down. So, even in order to get the same amount of money or project the same amount of money as what they got the year before, if property values go down, then the compensating rate would go up. So you've increased taxes per se, even though you're only getting the same amount of money that you got from local property the year before.
Yeah, and that can be a hard sell as a local board to raise taxes to get the same revenue. So definitely we've seen that happen. We can go to the next slide, please. So you will hear quite a bit and we've talked about this, a few times about nickel equivalent taxes. And, when I started here, I guess 2008, 2007, these were sort of a mysterious thing, and they're really not too mysterious. It's a portion of the overall tax rate that's dedicated to pay for facilities renovation or construction. Really no different than us, with our mortgage payment. We're sort of restricting, hopefully we are, a portion of our salary for a mortgage payment. And that's what the districts are required to do by law. There's one that each district has called the Facility Support Program of Kentucky, or FSPK. And then, there are some historically they've written into legislation, and that's allowed districts to, for certain situations like, Oldham County grew very fast for years. So there was a, sort of a carve out for those growth districts to help them build buildings and quite frankly, build them very fast. There was another special nickel for BRAC, which was base realignment. for Fort Knox and Hardin County. And, we don't know what the future holds. So they could always write legislation and said, if you're a district that has this issue, you can do this, nickel equivalent tax. And they, basically set it on their local tax rate. It's on the bill. Citizens pay it, companies pay it, and then they restrict the funds for renovations or new construction. And really the reason they do it, or rather one reason districts levy this or local boards levy it, is to get equalized by the General Assembly, which is a formula. Some districts don't get equalized. We'll talk a little more about property wealth later. But this is a very important part of, I think, the overall, universe of finance. Is this is how we pay for buildings. And you will hear districts talk about construction costs going way up, and the nickels just don't keep up with paying for maybe a new high school or new middle school or what have you. Right now, there is only one active what they can levy at any given time, is that recallable nickel equivalent. This is subject to a petition that would force a vote. And if you're, we had this year, I think more than we've ever had as far as districts that levied it. I think 16, if I remember correctly. It can be a little rough of a process. Once your board kind of shows their cards and says, we want to do this recallable nickel, the public can get a petition together and, force a vote. They can, as we've seen, get on Facebook, make all kinds of false statements, but the nickel is only applied to real property and tangible property, not motor vehicles. And I know, Dr. Fletcher has asked us, and I know this has popped up before, about, how we fund facilities now versus, what else is out there. In other states, how do they do it? I think this is a pretty big topic as well as a big issue. The cost of construction, even during COVID, was really, really getting escalated, and the funding was just, and no fault of the General Assembly. The nickels are what they are. It's math. It's just very difficult for districts to keep up. When a $50 million building is almost unattainable for some districts at that point. So I think this one kind of keeps circling around as a, something that we'll be talking about for, quite a while. You can go to the next slide, please. So occupational tax, you won't see this one very often in school districts. Jefferson County, Fayette, there's a handful that have it, but this only applies to residents of the school district that also work within those same boundaries. So for JCPS, I'd have to work there and live in that community. And that is I believe, a constitutional issue. That's how that tax is applied. And it can go up to 0.75%. There's an occupational tax of your wages, but also when you go to start a business. I think Warren County is another one that has this one. I think Cumberland, which is kind of an odd one to have this, but they got it. They've had it for many, many, many years. You can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. Utility gross receipts license tax. This one you'll see on your bill. You'll see it when you get your electric bill. It's a pretty small percentage. Any furnishing utility services or cable within the district. We've had it here in Frankfort. Right over my shoulder here is our local utility. It's on that bill every time I get it. So a portion of those taxes goes back to the Department of Revenue, and they cut a check to the school districts. Not too many districts don't have this one, but there are a few. You can go to the next slide, please. And excise. This is a strange one. So nobody levies this one, but it's not to exceed 20% on a county resident state individual income tax liability. And I imagine what this is that if you have a tax liability, the school district could in fact tax your tax liability. Obviously, I don't think it'd be very popular, but no districts have attempted to my knowledge, or have levied this one yet. We can go to the next slide, please. So on the utility gross receipts, we've only got 14 districts that don't levy this one. Of importance, JCPS does not levy this one. They never have. Now they do occupational there, which generates quite a bit of funding for them. About 157 do levy that one, but occupational is kind of flipped around, if you will. Most districts don't levy that one, but 8 do. Nobody, of course, like I said, does the excise. And then watercraft and aircraft are kind of split. And if you think about aircraft, if you don't have an airport in your community, you're probably not going to tax aircraft. Interestingly, I had a call from a district asking about taxing aircraft one time, and I had to think about it. And I thought, well, they didn't have an airport, but a CEO parked his helicopter there, and they were going to tax it. So, if you've got a helicopter, I guess you could get taxed. I know that's a problem for many of us with our personal aircraft and everything. So, but we can go to the next slide, please. All right. So one thing that I present on a lot is about SEEK. It's the program that's been in place for quite some time. There's a very interesting history. I always tell people to read the court decision, which doesn't sound like fascinating reading, but it really is. If you read
Jay,
oh,
I'm
yes.
going to interrupt you just
Yes, ma'am.
and ask, are there questions about sources of revenue? I mean, you got to know where the money can come from. And we've kind of gone through that at this point.
Jay, I thought of one, and maybe that just for
Sure.
some extra information. When you talk about the General Assembly equalizing a nickel, what does that mean?
So if you think of it, let's just take a total tax rate, and all that tax revenue is coming into the local district, and we tell them you've got to restrict a portion of it. And I'll just give you a live example. Conveniently, I can pull this up pretty quickly. And I'll pick on Adair County, poor Adair County, first district on my list. Locally, they're going to restrict $572,000 out of their local taxes. And the way equalization at the state level works, and like I said, it's a formula, so it's not, dollar for dollar or anything like that. But Adair County gets from the state $844,000. So it's a pretty nice return, if you will, on that local nickel. They put up $544,000, they get $844,000 from the state. So if we go down to Allen County, it's a little different. Allen County, the math works a little differently. They would put up about $800,000 and get back about $800,000. So almost, great return still. But then when you get to somebody like Anchorage, whose property wealth is, very, very high, they get zero. And that's the way the formula works. Once it goes above a certain point, they get no equalization from the state. And we'll talk a little more about that property wealth and how it impacts that. It's a very good question, Matt.
Thank you. So now let's go to SEEK.
All right. So as I said, that court decision, when you read into it, and I don't know why it took me so long to read bits and pieces of it, but I read even the dissenting opinions, and there was something in there that I thought, wow, this guy could see into the future what was going to happen. And it's very fascinating when you know sort of the backstory. And I've read, things here and there. Of course, Google helps, and there's quite a few snippets online about it. But there's some really interesting history. And, as part of that Education Reform Act, 1990, you had that court decision, and SEEK was that model that came out of that. And when you look at it sort of at the highest level, it's an allocation model. And it's, over time, there's not been a huge sweeping change to it. No massive reform. It's been really about the same. There's a few bells and whistles added to it, but it's not changed a whole lot since the beginning. The basic structure of it is the same. And, what I call the ingredients going in, they've added a few things and tweaked a few things, but it's generally about the same. Now, is it perfect? Probably not. It's not up for me to decide. But it is, basically we have a regulation that tells us this is how you do the math. And, we do this allocation. Now, what lies in the future for this model, who knows? But it's really important to understand, I believe, the history of this when you are looking at the future. What do we want want and what's changed and what do we want as a state on how we fund K through 12. And if you go back to the earlier slides where I showed the pie chart, this is one section of that state funding. There's state grants, which are outside of SEEK. There's federal money, which is definitely outside of SEEK, and then local. But this is a sort of slice of that state pie, a significant slice, but still, it's just a portion of that. And you can go to the next slide, please.
Okay, I think
Yes.
your analogy of a seesaw, right? So
Yeah.
to think of state and local funding as a seesaw. When local funding, local property wealth is high, the state share is lower. When the state share is higher, the local property wealth, local revenue is less, right?
Yeah, and if you go to the most basic statement, I think in that court decision is, well, if you've got the property wealth, you can generate that money locally. Now, to be frank, if you go to the districts with that property wealth and you say, oh, but you can do this locally, they're going to push back and say, yeah, but we do a lot locally. Now, if you're on the other end of that, you simply cannot generate that level of tax revenue locally. You just can't do it. The assessment values aren't there. And I always give this example of like Scott County 30, 40 years ago versus now, pre-Toyota, post-Toyota, very different community for sure. Now, many, many factories, many businesses, many homes, many apartments. It's full, it's a very, very busy place. But, even Shelby County to some degree, 20, 30 years ago, definitely not the same. And so that's changed for them. And over time, of course, Northern Kentucky, the same story, developments, airports are built, highways are built. Everything that happens with economic development can impact a community. And if you're in a rural county, which is mostly agricultural, you may not see this type of growth, and your property assessments just don't grow nearly at the rate that some others do. And of course, in the last couple of years, we've seen some pretty wild property assessment growth. If you all recall, Superintendent Mike Stacy came in from Beechwood to a meeting, it's been quite some time ago, and talked about they had over 30% real estate growth, which is just really crazy. And so things like that impact the formula. We'll talk about that a little more. But one of the first things, and conveniently, what a great day to have this call, because Governor Beshear, I believe, is doing his governor's budget presentation tonight, if I remember correctly. He more than likely will mention this SEEK guaranteed base number. Most governors in their state of the Commonwealth always mention this number, and it's important. Don't mean to diminish the importance of this number, but there's a little bit more story behind this number by each district. But historically, when I think I started at KDE, it was in the neighborhood of like 2,700 per pupil. So it's grown quite a bit. And you will hear a lot of commentary during session, which I know has already started, about it needs to be here, it needs to be here. But I have to do the math based on where the General Assembly eventually sets it, which currently is $4,586 per pupil. But, and I'll get to the but here in a few minutes, but remember that number, it's really important. And over time, like I said, the General Assembly does have a really good track record of nudging it up each and every budget. I believe one budget we had it, the same number twice, so it was relatively flat. But this is a very important part of the overall formula. You can go to the next. And if you think of it, that's really the start of the numbers, and you think about, I got to plug this number in, and we're going to start doing a little bit of math. And that growth number is actually multiplied by what you see on your screen, which is basically the number of students at the most basic level. But there's a lot of work behind this number of students. It's called aggregate average daily attendance. We love rear ends and seats. We want those kids to be in school. That's how they learn. And the higher the attendance percentage, the more aggregate average daily attendance these districts will have. There's a lot of adjustments for low attendance days. They throw a few of those out. Bad weather, the usual. But there's some also weird things that happen. As you might recall, we had a lot of districts closed down for a while because of the shooter on, was it I-75 around London, Laurel County? Was that 2 years ago now, I think? But weird situations, floods, tornadoes. I mean, almost everything can impact attendance. Flu. And I never imagined coming to this job, I would be talking to people about flu outbreaks, of course, COVID being the big one. So all these things impact attendance. Much respect to the district or the DPPs that are out trying to get these kids in school. It's a very tough job, but attendance can mean money. And everybody that works in this business knows that. So it's really incentivized to get those kids in school and to get them to class. We use to initially start with is the prior year, end of year ADA. So you think about June 30th, I'm looking behind me to say, how many kids did you have at Adair County? And they will report it to us. I have a handful of people up here that work through that data. And then a couple months later, we get a current year number to say, well, did you grow any? And you get sort of a bonus kick if you grew some. And that's to help pay for, hey, I picked up, 50 kids compared to last year, and I've got to hire some staff. So there's a little bit of that prior year, and then we look at the current year too. There's also all the way into January, if funds are available, they'll do another snapshot. Did you grow again? To help pay for, additional kids, staffing, whatever it may be. This is a really, really important number, and we actually have staff that go out and, it's called an audit, but it's really a review, and they help districts. And there's a lot of intricate details to how a kid's recorded. If that kid takes a class in the next county over, if that kid goes to a vocational school, if that kid, does a couple virtual classes or whatever. There's all these different situations, and we have some really, really good staff. I'm always very proud of the work they do because they typically help districts clean up their data, and in a lot of cases, find them some additional funding through, ADA. So very proud of that work, and can't say enough about the good work they do. We can go to the next slide, please. So kindergarten, some of you have been around long enough to know that some previous boards' legislative agenda was fully funding kindergarten students. And that goes back, I think it's about as long as I've been at KDE, that's been talked about. Well, eventually in 2022, big round of applause for General Assembly, they did fully fund it. And previous to that, we were paying 50% of that AADA that was just mentioned for kindergarten kids. And I used to joke it's because they were shorter, but it's not. It was 50%. And then the General Assembly came and said, we're going to kick that up to 100% funding. So this injected about, if you total it up, about 170 million, a little bit more than that, additional funding into our school systems, or K through 12 systems. So this is a really big change, and really, really, can't say enough. This was a really good thing, I believe. But to our past board's credits, this was always on the sort of the front burner that I recall, that this was a topic of discussion, and certainly something that we were very happy to see. You can go to the next slide, please. So when we talk about our students in the ADA and getting them there, making sure they go to class, we start to look at what we call add-ons, and this one is specifically for free lunch students. And you see a little bit of a percentage of this, about $687 they'll get in addition to. So I'm going to take a very generic average student, and that student's going to generate the $4,586. And in that same student's free lunch student, they're going to generate an additional $687. And again, this is prior year data, so we're kind of looking over our shoulder at that old data. And the reason I believe they've done that historically is it gives time for that data to be cleaned up and corrected, and it get a little bit better data quality. It's really hard. These kids move a lot, and keeping the kids coded correctly, they're in, they're out. They went to this district, they moved to here. It's really hard to do that until that end of the year. You can go to the next slide, please. Another add-on is they get $100 per AADA, which is that aggregate average daily attendance always mentioned. This hasn't changed. This dollar amount hasn't changed since 1954. But these funds are restricted for construction or renovation of facilities. So it's just, again, a little add-on. And so that generic student would generate this automatically. You can go to the next one. Thank you. Now, this one we talk about quite a bit, exceptional child count. And you've probably heard a bit about this when we talk about, our overall budget. Within SEEK, this is a very large amount of SEEK. We have quite a few students that are categorized in this exceptional child count. And we'll get into details of this in the next slide. But basically, out in the districts, they're recording these students who are ages 3 through 21, and the Office of Special Education Early Learning right across the hall from me, they're going to give me this data. Now, this is kind of an odd date, December 1. It's not prior year, but it just happened about, a month ago. And they start sending me some kind of draft data, say, here are our numbers, and we'll use that in the upcoming SEEK year. So it's kind of split in a weird part of the year. But I only get to use the kids who are ages 5 through 20. And though that generates funding for the district, and these are unrestricted funds. So when you say, well, it's exceptional child count and it generates these funds, these all go out to the district as general funds, and then within their budget process, they have to carve out money for, special education programs, et cetera. So my program doesn't really dictate that. They're doing that at the local level. And if you notice, and we'll talk about the categories in great detail in a second, but the most severe students in the exceptional child count, that factor of 2.35, it really generates an additional $10,000. So going back to our generic student example, if he or she was a severe student, they do that, base number of $4,586 plus the $100 for capital outlay, free lunch. You get another $600 plus this, around $10,000. The moderate group, which is a pretty big chunk, is about a bit over $5,300. And then you have your speech students. These are those students, and there's a process behind these numbers that it's not just, well, I've coded that kid a speech kid. There's a process where they're tested in and out and things like that. There's an individual education program or plan, excuse me. And, that determines what that student's needs are. There's an art committee that gets together, and there's a whole big process that the Office of Special Education and Early Learning can speak to a lot better than I can. But this is a really important part of our funding. This is a big chunk of our students, and this money goes to a lot of, every district's got these students, and there's a lot of programs that impact these students. And the more I work here, the more I learn about these programs and, what the needs are, and each of these students may have a very different need. So if we can go to the next slide. We talk about the categories. The most high incidents are going to be your communication disorders or of speech or language. I was one of those students. Shout out to Mrs. Griffith in 3rd grade. And moderate. This is a pretty, that group in the middle there covers orthopedically impaired, other health impaired. Again, then when you get to the most severe, you've got functional or FMDs, what some call functional mental disability, emotional behavior disability, deaf and blind, autism, et cetera. So these categories, I don't believe have changed in as long as I can remember. But again, going back to the funding, each of these categories generates a different amount of funding. Now, a question that I think is logical is, well, if they each generate a different amount of funding, and let's take a severe student, which is a little bit over $10,000, what does a district spend? Well, it varies, but I think without even seeing a number, districts spend quite a bit more than we give them on the exceptional child count in their community. It is a really expensive part of their budget. So when you talk to your local superintendents, principals, teachers, et cetera, chances are they're going to say we spend, double or then some we send them 10,000, they might spend 20 to 25 on that same student. So again, we pay very close attention to this number. I think overall in SEEK, it's getting close to 600 million of my SEEK budget is exceptional. So a very, very important part of that number. We can go to the next part, please. So another group of students, limited English proficient students. You will see pockets of this in our state, and then some districts will have, 1 or 2. This is a really interesting category to me. it generates a little bit of money, additional funding, but it has its own challenges. I know Bowling Green opened up, and I always get the name wrong. It's an academy, and Jefferson County once threw out a number. I think they had, like 100 different languages or something like that within their district. And with those languages, and a kid walks in the door and speaks the language, you have to have the staff to be able to work with that student and the teachers. So it's, Bowling Green, Warren County, JCPS, I'm sure Fayette and others have that challenge of finding qualified teachers, qualified instructional aides that speak those languages and can teach those students and assist those students and families. So this is a very interesting number to me. It grows a little bit as a state. We've grown some. It's not very fast growing in the last couple of 10 years or so. Again, these students can test out once they've been coded as a limited English student. Then eventually, as they go through school, they'll eventually test out of that. And I think they have 5 years in this category, maybe something like that. You can go to the next slide, please. So another group of students, and unfortunately, a student may become injured, ill, and may be, out of school for a while. But the education we want to continue. They will send a teacher out to visit the student, and hopefully it's temporary. But this also generates some additional funding to help pay for those services, less that $100, which, if you go back a few slides, was for the $100 capital outlay or facilities money. This number just kind of stays static. You'll have maybe a kid breaks their leg and it's really difficult for them to get to school. They may get those services, or students in the hospital, et cetera. So this number doesn't grow a whole lot. You can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. I noticed I got quoted somewhere of using the word gnarly to explain the transportation formula. It is indeed gnarly. It's SEEK is a little complicated. Transportation is complicated on steroids, I think. This is a really, I think, important part of the overall funding. It's a sizable amount of money. But it's based on the frequency, distance, and type of transportation provided. So the most generic example I always give is, I would walk to my bus stop. I lived 2-3 miles from my elementary school. So that was over a mile. I was coded as what's known as a T1. But I had friends that lived right down the street from the school. They could walk. They were a non-transported. So all these things come in, plus the cost of transporting to and from school. And there's a big long formula. Bus purchases go into that formula. A really great thing we have, and it's pretty old thing, but it's been really, I think, one of the unsung heroes in transportation's formula is a depreciation schedule where the state helps sort of offset the cost of these buses. We have some amazing transportation in our state. Across the state, it's very different. If you're a bus driver in, Edmonson County versus Pikeville, or Martin County versus Ballard County, it's going to be different across the state. But we have some fantastically trained people, and part of that is they want to maintain their fleet and be efficient, and that depreciation comes into play. And again, they recover about 124% over a 14-year period. Now, there's a little bit of an asterisk there because of the way that transportation's not fully funded, so they don't quite get all of that. If they're adding students, like we mentioned earlier about growth, there's some additional money for that. There's some also additional money if you're, I'll say, Anderson County, and you're taking a student to KSD down in Danville. There's some additional funding for that, and vocational transportation. There's quite obviously many districts transport kids to that. And one of the things, ironically, when I started, transportation funding started getting less and less. And it was probably because I started at that time. But more recently, the General Assembly upped the funding, and we're about 81% funded, which is huge compared to where we used to be. It's still not 100, obviously, but it's a really, really significant increase in our funding. And if you go to the next slide, I think that's the next one. Yeah, this is the one I wanted to look at. So back just not terribly long ago, pre-COVID, we were in the neighborhood of 55% funded in transportation. So somebody asked that question, well, where's that other percent come from? It comes from the school district's local funding. And any of my superintendents on here or former superintendents will tell you it's a big chunk of their budget. And it can get pretty expensive when fuel prices go up, tire prices go up, labor costs go up, overtime, et cetera, et cetera. This is a pretty expensive part of operating a school district. The other part of this too that you don't hear a lot about, and we hope it maintains this way, is safety. And maintaining these buses, brakes, tires, lights, et cetera. They do a great job. We do not want accidents, and that costs money to maintain buses and keep them safe and everything. But as you'll notice, slowly but surely, they finally got that up to about 398 million is our current appropriation. And then overall cost, after COVID, of course, it shot up quite a bit. We're sitting around 487 million. But this again was a previous boards of education here. This is one of their legislative priorities, and finally it got bumped up quite a bit. And give some credit to the General Assembly. This is quite a bit of money that they put into this appropriation. We can go to the next slide, please. So another one, Tier 1 funding. So a couple years ago, this Tier 1's been in our formula, SEEK formula, for a long time. Pretty boring number. It's significant, and I think 170, 180 million dollars or so of our big total. And it's basically, to me, it's always been sort of the carrot at the end of the stick. And what this does is, if a local district, or I should say local board, generates enough money compared to 15% of SEEK, then they get sort of a bonus, and it's all good. And many districts qualified for this, and they were getting their money. But not terribly long ago, 2024 session, General Assembly decided again 17.5% instead of 15, and that brought in an additional 44 million to my school districts. Very excited. Didn't see this one coming. It's just not a really exciting appropriation, but that small percentage change meant quite a bit to many districts. Now, not all districts get Tier 1 funding because of their property wealth that Matt mentioned earlier, which we're going to show some examples of that. But this is a really important bucket of money for many districts, and that small increase of 44 million, I know it doesn't sound small, but overall it's pretty small, but it meant a lot to these districts. So we were quite happy to see that as well. You can go to the next slide, please. So we're back to talking property assessments, and talking about local taxes earlier, and local boards generate their local revenue from this. So why are we talking about it again? Well, we got to talk about local effort and this seesaw effect that school districts experience. And really the best example I can always give is like a Scott County or Shelby County that has grown significantly in the last umpteen years. And as people move in, they build houses, jobs are created, property wealth comes in, and plus the national market impacts these things, and all that goes into a formula, and we deduct 30 cents per $100 of property assessments from their SEEK funding. Now, that sounds a little bit convoluted, so let me put this in real terms. If your assessment grows, like Superintendent Stacy mentioned a couple years ago, 30%, we were taking quite a bit and deducting it from his SEEK funding. This is a function of the formula. I don't do it out of meanness. It is how the formula works. And that property wealth, or lack thereof, really determines sort of the state share and the local share. If you're not getting much from the state, maybe a JCPS or definitely an Anchorage, you may have to generate more locally to pay for staff, buses, field trips, et cetera. And if you're on the other end of that, you're less property wealthy, maybe a Leslie County, you're going to generate more through state funding, but you just don't have the ability to go out and say, we're going to set our taxes at 80 cents and generate millions of dollars, because they don't have the infrastructure. They don't have a Ford plant in their backyard, or a Toyota, or a million dollar homes all over the place. So these things matter. And when we probably pre-COVID, sort of in the middle of COVID, when home prices really started going up, and we we were paying very close attention to that. We would look at, obviously locally and say, that's kind of, a big jump, or maybe around Fayette County. Madison County's grown significantly, Jessamine County's grown significantly. So all that growth means something to those school districts. And like I said, it's reduced from the funding. So if you took, again, a generic student and you said, here's all the money that generic student generates, we're going to eventually reduce that money by the local effort amount that you see on your screen there, 30 cents per $100. And if you go back, well, again, we'll show an example here in a second, and you're in a district that just doesn't have any growth at all, home prices are about the same, no new factories, things like that, no new development, your property assessment stays pretty stagnant. But most districts in the last couple of years have experienced, at minimum 3 and 4%. Some districts 10%, which is, kind of crazy to think about. The other thing that can impact this is tax exempt property. We get quite a few calls about this. And your universities typically, if they go out and buy 1,000 acres in a community, that's going to impact a school district, or, government owned stuff. If, the state government decides to buy 150 acres, it becomes exempt from local taxes. So that impacts a community or a school district as well. You can go to the next slide, please. So we talk about that local effort. We can show 1,000 examples of this, but this is really the most basic and kind of generic example. So we talked about that, base guarantee amount, and we want to kind of extract this a little differently and say, each kid generates this amount of money, but that local effort is different in each school district. And not to pick on my neighbors here, but Frankfort Independent, their local effort on a per pupil basis is smaller than Franklin County. And that's based on just property wealth. Like I said, the 30 cents per $100. And so when they get down to the nitty gritty of their funding, Frankfort student there generates more, generically speaking, than Franklin County. And if you go and do, say, a Dayton Independent and a Campbell County, it's going to look a little different. If you go and do Pineville, Middlesboro, Bell County, it's going to look a little different. So this is a really important part of that formula that, we emphasize, because when you hear that per pupil amount, guess what? I'm reducing that. So no matter, what they say it is, there's always that local effort reduction, and we always keep that in mind. So I'm always happy to see it increase, the per pupil amount, that 4586, but at the same time, I know there's going to be a reduction there. And again, that's part of the formula. We can go to the next slide, please. So again, we talk about this generic student, but here's another example, and it's a little bit more, I think a little bit more of a difference. Again, the base guarantee in Wolfe County, same as it is in Fayette County. But look at that local effort. It's a little different. Wolfe County is a lot smaller in, local effort. Fayette County is quite a bit larger. But tier 1, again, Wolfe County gets a little bit of it, $979 per student roughly. And Fayette County doesn't qualify for it because of their property wealth being a little too high. It's not their fault. It's just Fayette County. So your state funding per pupil, look at that, huge difference there. And then when you get into local taxes, you still have, and that's again, all local board decisions. And that's where you get into some interesting, dynamics about, Fayette County has historically, there are many, many boards over the years, they've levied taxes to, help pay for the many programs that Fayette County Schools does, or their, STEM academies or whatever, what have you. And you look at Wolfe County, again, a very different number. They just cannot generate, almost 12,000 locally. So they generate about 3,500 locally. And it's a very different dynamic in both of these counties. So to me, this is sort of the gist of SEEK. And when you say, well, could you distill it down in one slide? This is probably it. That really shows the difference. And we do have, from north, south, east, and west, some very, very different school districts. I can look on the screen right here and I see, Randy was in Boone, Lou was in Jessamine, very different districts. And with, different needs, wants, et cetera. But the funding is what it is. And if Boone County's board, and I'm sure Jessamyn's too, wanted to do some extra stuff, they're going to have to do it locally with, local taxes. So, and we talked to board members quite a bit about this as well. This to me is just a very, very integral part of understanding our funding in this state. We can go to the next slide, please. So we talked about property wealth. This again is like probably, part 2.0 of what's important. Once your district sort of exceeds, right now it's, this per pupil statewide average property assessment, you get no nickel equalization, which we talked about earlier. You get no tier 1 funding, and you've just kind of crossed the line into, you get less state money and, less state assistance, if you will. Right now, and I could tell you when I started, this was a smaller group of districts, but right now we have several that have kind of crossed into, this sort of bubble of districts whose property wealth on a per pupil basis exceeds 1.2 million. You'll recognize Anchorage is the big one. And give you an idea, Anchorage's property wealth per pupil right now is 1.7 million, by far the highest in the state. Campbell has been in that, above that for many, many, many years. Boone, I'm sure the same. Fayette and Jefferson. And you get to Livingston and Lyon, and some people kind of look at that and think, well, that's kind of odd because they're different, Western Kentucky. Their property wealth and the number of students impacts them. Their property wealth is pretty high because of the lakes. And we've even gotten, calls from the superintendents about, lake property sells pretty high, I guess, and they have a small number of students. So their per pupil amounts, pretty significant. Nelson County, if you've been through there in the last umpteen years, it's like one long continuous bourbon warehouse in Nelson County, and their property wealth has moved up quite a bit. And they just recently kind of crossed into, I'm not trying to be rude, I'm going to look and see what theirs is now, but they're at 1.3 million. So they just kind of went right above that 1.2 million pretty recently. And so they no longer qualify for a nickel equalization or tier 1 funding. And that's a really important part of that formula too. You can go to the next slide, please. So we talked about property wealth. Well, what happens if your Anchorage and your property wealth goes through the roof? And it gets in that SEEK formula. And you all remember me saying we reduce SEEK by their local effort. If it gets too high and they would have received less than they did in 1992, there's actually what's called hold harmless. And we do sort of say, oh, we took too much, and we kind of get them back to 1991-92 per pupil levels. And that's a lot of words, but basically there's a hold harmless provision that says you're not going to get less than you did in 1991-92 on a per pupil basis. Now, I would say 1991-92 is quite a long time ago, and the funding may have been a little different then, but this is currently the law. And we've got a handful of districts that get, Anchorage gets the most hold harmless because of their property wealth, and then the others get, a smaller amount. And again, when I started here, Anchorage, I think, was the only district that got it. Now we've got quite a few more that have fallen into hold harmless. You can go to the next slide, please. So all that money and all those numbers, we have to develop a budget. If we go back in the fall, about, September, KDE and the Office of State Budget Director will meet, and we start talking about, me specifically and my staff, we'll talk to them about SEEK. And, our esteemed Budget Director, Karen Worth, is in the room, and this is sort of my sort of piece of the pie that I help sort of talk to them about, estimating numbers for the upcoming biennium for the next 2 years. And we want to get to like a consensus and agree that, yep, here's where we think the numbers are. And very smart economists, they'll use models, and I'll tell them this is what we know. And somehow we eventually get to an agreement. We may wrestle through it. We may argue through it. I'm not sure how we get to it, but we get there. And, we want these numbers to be very close to actual data. And, these are big numbers. So, when we're 1% off, it's 30 million. you're 2% off, you're getting into some real money. So we want it to be very, very tight. And what we really, really want, and what I want more than anything for Christmas, if you're looking for a gift, is to have enough money for all school districts and no shortfall. It means a lot to me to make sure these numbers are correct, but I don't want districts having to deal with staffing and, any type of potential cuts. Nobody wants that. But we've got to do this in a way that is sort of controlled chaos, if you will, and, do estimates and get these numbers, pretty close. We do property assessment estimates, ADA, as I mentioned earlier, all the ingredients that go into SEEK, that's what we're sort of estimating. And then we build a budget off of that. We kind of run it through our formula and say, here's what FY27 will look like. Here's what FY28 will look like. Over time, if you can go to the next slide. We talk about shortfalls. This is when I pull out my hair and do a lot of, 5 a.m. messages to Matt Ross, which I'm sure he appreciates. But when our estimates are, and it's all kind of mixed in, so it's a little hard to pin it down until, okay, we ran a calculation, we're short, we don't have our cost exceeded our budget, and we'll usually sit down and go, here's what the shortfall is currently. And, sometimes there's excess where we've, underestimated the number, or overestimated, and we've got some cushion there. And that's much preferable to a shortfall. And when we do, we communicate with the governor's office. Obviously, that's basically our first path. And in some cases, a couple of years ago, we also talked to the General Assembly, Commissioner Fletcher, and can speak to that. But ultimately, if there is excess, budget language tells us, where's that excess go? I think currently it may go to the Budget Reserve Trust Fund or something like that. We don't get to keep it. Or specifically, I don't get to keep it, but it goes somewhere that the General Assembly determines. And, this is a really, really important part of my job, and it's really important we get it right, obviously. Very stressful. We want to make sure that, this is done correctly. But also, we communicate with larger districts to understand, what are you all seeing? What trends do you see? I talked to JCPS quite a bit. They've got some really fantastic data people. Fayette County, Warren County, we'll talk to them about, what kind of growth are you seeing down there? Is it slowed down? And we also kind of look around at property. We want to know, is, property still pretty hot, or houses being sold for, well over what we think they should be? And those things all impact SEEK. And so we want to make sure we get all the best data we possibly can. You can go to the next slide, please. So historically, this is what excess and shortfalls look like. Gratefully, if you look at the excess side, we've got more than we've had shortfalls. And I was here in 2011, 2012. Those are big shortfalls. We didn't like that. It was really uncomfortable. And if you notice, they come in chunks. They come in twos. And there's a reason for that. And our budget is a 2-year budget. And then, of course, if you recall, I believe this has been mentioned before, but we had about a $14-15 million shortfall, which gratefully was covered by Governor Beshear in the last fiscal year. And they had found the funds and, took care of that. We were extremely happy about that. Commissioner Fletcher, I don't want to put you on a spot. Did you want to add anything on this section?
I suspect the commissioner has already is en route to the Capitol for for the speech.
Can
but
you hear
Jay,
me? Yes.
and Matt, I want to commend you for getting all of this together because it does kind of put things in perspective. This budget process itself, it's beyond the sausage making, if you will, because it's leading indicators on in some areas, lagging indicators in other areas. And then, kind of the foundation of it all is property values.
Yeah.
And Lord have mercy. I mean, that's not it's a very unstable formula that I guess the formula is stable, but the elements within it can be very unstable, right?
So most certainly. I think over time, We used to sit around with the state economist and they'd say, on average, we'd expect 3 to 4% growth in property assessments as a state every year. Of course, in each school district, it varies. And now, to see 7 and 8%, which we used to think was absurd, is more normal. And we
Yeah.
have districts, some in Eastern Kentucky that actually show declines in property assessments.
Right.
Post kind
I
of
will add-
pre-COVID.
Right.
And I'll add to the process, we get to inform the process, but we ultimately don't get to make that decision, right?
Yeah,
We get to weigh in, and the Office of State Budget Director and the governor ultimately get to make their budget recommendation. And their economists really use their models to set that number. I think the commissioners on here, he may want to say something.
Oh,
Yeah. Thank you so much, Matt. Yes, I am en route. Thank you so much, Chair Robinson. Last year we do thank Governor Beshear for stepping in and helping us out. But one of the things that's allowed for a commissioner or a secretary, or if there is a budget unit, if you will, like BOSS, LARS, others that we've talked about earlier, SEEK, that we can move. I can request funding from the Office of the State Budget Director for his approval up to 5% if there is a shortfall in one area or another. So last year we did not, I don't think we had that option of moving from one area to another, so we had to resort to talking with the governor's office. And again, now this year we've had some just looking at different budget units and moving things around, we were able to avoid that second year of a overall shortfall where districts would see the penalty, because we were able to request from the Office of State Budget Director moving money from one budget unit to another. So again, a lot of intricacies there that I've learned over the past year from Jay and Matt, and also from OSBD. That's been very helpful to us.
let me see if there are other questions. I know we're right up against the time, but I do want to make sure to at least note questions and give our board members a chance to raise questions. So please, I have to toggle through to see hands up, and I'm not seeing any. Okay, this has been an amazingly informative presentation, and
I
I've got,
do see one
yes,
now.
I do have
I do
hands
see
up.
one now from Alfonso.
Alfonso, please.
Hi. So I have several questions, but for the sake of time, I will direct those later on to the appropriate people. But yeah, just to say very quickly, oh my goodness, what an amazing presentation. Like please understand my background as a person from another country who came here many years ago. I wish I would have been told and taught all this very detailed information, especially when I was working at KDE years ago, because this is not just informative, this gives a lot of perspective about a lot of different themes. And you can clearly see all of the angles that many conversations can take regarding funding about this or that or whatnot. So I do really appreciate very much the information that has been shared with us this afternoon. And I'm gonna say thank you in advance for your patience in addressing the questions that I will send your way.
Well,
So
thank
so
you.
much.
Yeah. And we're always happy to answer questions. That's what we're here for.
And we're always
Absolutely.
happy to meet with board members one-on-one if they want to
Yeah,
have
absolutely.
more discussion. So I'll throw that out as an offer.
Thank you, Alfonso. Other questions? I do want to round back to a question on the previous section where we were talking about contracts. And Todd, you have some additional information to share?
Sure. Thank you, Chair Robinson. And this is a follow-up to the question posed by Dr. Poe that I said I would look into while Matt and Che were doing their presentation. I did some quick research. And Dr. Poe, I think the statute that you were referencing is KRS 158-6453. That statute in subsection 3 says the Kentucky Board of Education shall be responsible for creating and implementing a balanced statewide assessment program that measures students, schools, and districts' achievement of goals set forth in KRS 158.645 and 158.6451 to ensure compliance with the Federal Every Student Succeeds Act or its successor, and to ensure school accountability. Am I following you there, Dr. Poe? Is that what you were referring to?
You're muted.
You're on mute, but I think I
No,
see
trying
yes.
to get it. Yes.
Okay. So I went back and pulled our 1990 version of the Kentucky Revised Statutes, and that language nearly verbatim existed in KARA in 1990, but the statute was much smaller. It was really only that language, and it was essentially the instruction to the state board to create a statewide assessment and accountability system, right? But the General Assembly at that point did not tell the state board which assessments had to be in the assessment and accountability system. Fast forward to current day, if you look to subsection 5 of that same statute, 158.6453, the General Assembly has added more language. It says the state student assessments shall include the following components. Down in paragraph B, it says high school requirements are, and then subparagraph 5, it says a college admissions examination to assess English, reading, math, and science in the spring of grade 11. It goes on to say the Kentucky Board of Education shall add any other component necessary to comply with the Every Student Succeeds Act or its successor as determined by the U.S. Department of Education. So since that original language, Dr. Poe, that you're referencing, the General Assembly has told us what must be in the statewide assessment system. The board doesn't have any discretion to determine whether or not there's going to be a college admissions examination. There shall be one. It shall be administered at the grade 11 in spring of grade 11. So I think that's what puts us back to that language, Dr. Poe, of the board's ability to either act on all contracts or to delegate that authority to the department. Here, we know that there must be a college admissions examination at the junior year, and the department went through the procurement process to procure a vendor and select them. But the board doesn't have the authority now to determine whether or not there is going to be a college admissions examination. I also followed up just for some historical detail on that, and was told that it's never been the case that the state board selected an assessment vendor. I think going back to that language and what we talked about in the presentation, if that's the board's goal, if that's what they want to do in the future, they would just need to take action to establish that policy to direct the department that they want to be involved in the selection of assessment vendors.
Okay, the only the follow-up question I had on that is, because in that same statute that you read, it said that, you know, this is where we're going to, I guess, talk about this in May, where we talked about it. It did specify that there had to be specifically 4 areas, and it always comes up with Lee Todd talks about in science, and it also talks about that post-secondary must be involved in that process. And there was an article in the Courier Journal that said, you know, from post-secondary, that said that they were not part of that process in the selection of that. And that's where it comes back to that question that we have the responsibility, or we've given the commissioner that responsibility, but that authority is still there upon us to make sure that that statute was followed. And now I guess there was and I don't want to get into all the specifics of the case because we can talk about that later, but it went back to that committee, whatever you had in that thing. There was the government committee. Did they review? Is that something that they then reviewed as part of that process or not? That was, to me, the key question that I thought was up for debate, and whether or not that government legislative oversight committee, if we're putting that in those contracts, they assured that was done. Is that what I'm getting from you then?
I'll address.
Would they be the ones?
I'll address all 3 of your questions.
Okay.
Question about the college admissions exam assessing science. The
Yeah.
vendor and the admissions exam that was selected does assess science. It is not by a separate testing section, but it does assess science. There is a science score, and the U.S. Department of Education has even approved that assessment as a statewide science assessment at high
Right.
school.
And that's what we're going to discuss in May, I think.
Yeah.
So I don't
So
need
the
detail,
second about post-secondary being involved, I think there was some confusion there because there is no statute that provides that post-secondary is involved in selecting the vendor for a college admissions assessment. There is indication that post-secondary is involved in setting academic standards and that process, but not for selecting a college admissions exam. So I think that's just some level of confusion.
Okay.
And then remind me what your third one. Oh, your third one was whether or not Government Contract Review Committee pulled this contract. I don't know the answer to that question. It most certainly would have been sent to them for them to potentially pull. Whether or not they did, I think would be a question for Matt and Karen.
Okay. Well, I just think, somewhere those, I think that's, from what I'm seeing from others and questioning from others and what I'm seeing in writing and what I've seen at the Courier Journal, those are questions that I think that ultimately we just need to have answered so we can move on from this particular topic. It either has been answered or it hasn't been answered.
Sure.
And they did that with when there was that review of it, I guess. That's all. Because I was under the understanding, at least from post-secondary representatives that had talked to me during that time, that they were supposed to be, the process was supposed to be coordinated with them, or they were supposed to be on the committee. And you're saying you're not. So
that's not correct. And they never have been in the past for selection of previous college admissions exam vendors either.
Okay. Thanks for reviewing that, and we'll see.
Okay,
That's all.
we do need to bring this meeting to a close, and because I'm very conscious of the time, I want to make sure the board members have an opportunity to share issues and comments, and particularly board members, questions that we need to address subsequent to this meeting or any other. I think we certainly, I've taken a couple of notes. We've got procurement and accountability issues that are still, that we will want to address in some way. And what else? Anything else? Please, the exit slip, if you will, is important to help us plan as we go forward with our learning sessions and work sessions that we are going to do virtually, but also help us plan the agendas for our in-person meetings that we will continue on the usual schedule. We anticipate upcoming topics for March. We're going to be looking at standards and assessment with a particular focus on science. And maybe we can, by then we will have cleared up all the procurement issues. And for May, we are definitely planning to have a legislative recap. We will have been through, we'll be nearing the end, I guess, of the session at that point. If sine die has not already happened, but we are anticipating that. And as I said before, in February, we are going to return to the issue of student outcome documentation and strategic targets of intervention, how we're using our resources to really get at targeted populations of students that really require some focus so that we can assure they're having the resources and our intention to see to their well-being, regardless of where they live, or anything else, but all students are having a fair chance. Lou?
Yes, just as we close here too, I wanted to punctuate a comment you made earlier and just remind the board after a long day of kind of direct instruction and learning, based on the requests of the board members, today was very much a tutorial, a primer on school finance in Kentucky, but we are already working on our March session and May to be highly interactive, very discussion oriented, and steeped on inquiry based on the kinds of questions that you guys have already posed. So just to kind of talk about how those sessions will be different from today. Today is what you asked for and certainly was well received, and I feel well informed. But the next sessions will be very different in tenor, I think.
Again, I want to thank the general counsel, the staff in OFO. I mean, you did a fabulous job. You've given us just a wealth of good information that, it's like putting a tag on it. I got a tag on this slide deck because it's just full of things you need to know. And I thank you again for participating in this meeting, board members. Thank the public who are involved. At this moment, I would love to entertain a motion to adjourn.
This is Steve Trimble, and I make the motion to adjourn.
Thank you, Steve. Is there a second? I need a second.
I second.
All right.
Holly
Thank
Bloodworth.
you so much. I
Couldn't
will
find a mute
call the
button.
question. All in favor of adjournment, please say aye.
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 Any opposed? Say no. Thank you, my friends. I declare this meeting adjourned.